Our second scripture lesson today is from Genesis chapter 22, verses 1 through 14. After these things, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham." And he said, "Here I am." He said, "Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I shall show you." So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. He cut the wood for the burnt offering, and set out and went to the place in the distance that God had shown him. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place far away. Then Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. So the 2 of them walked on together. Isaac said to his father Abraham, "Father?" And he said, "Here I am, my son." He said, "The fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God himself will provide the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." So the 2 of them walked on together. When they came to the place that God had shown him, Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to kill his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham!" And he said, "Here I am." He said, "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." And Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." As it is said to this day, "On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. This is the climactic story on our journey with Abraham. It's also the most enigmatic story of Abraham. To be told to sacrifice your child. But not just your child, but the one you waited and waited and waited for. The child who was promised and that you trusted would arrive. It hits our modern ears as a cruel command, as a wicked test. The word test here is curious. It opens the story. It's the only time in the book of Genesis that this Hebrew word is used. It's used 37 times in all of the Hebrew Bible. Each time it shows up, it is in a moment when Israel as a nation or an individual is being asked if they will trust the promises of God more than an increase in their own power, instead of compromising in order to bring peace, instead of constricting their life for protection, instead of opening themselves in vulnerability to others. The test here then, will Abraham relinquish control step out into the unknowing. Now that he has a son, now that the long-awaited promise has been fulfilled, will Abraham continue to follow the promise maker? The command, too, is kind of a request more than a demand. The English doesn't quite put it that way, but it's almost like God says, Abraham, will you take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and offer him as a burnt offering? Maybe that doesn't particularly soften the command or remove the cruelty, but it's more of a plea than an expectation. It's also important to read this story in light of the whole witness of Scripture. Within the Hebrew Bible, time and again, child sacrifice is forbidden. It is a practice of pagan nations who neighbor Israel. In Scripture, the early judge Jephthah is infamous because he sacrifices his daughter in a moment of foolish pride and promise. When the wicked kings, Ahaz and Manasseh, institute the practice of child sacrifice in the nation, it brings God's judgment on the nation, ultimately leading to the kingdom's destruction and a time of exile. To read this story, therefore, in light of what we know about God in the rest of Scripture, allows us to read this story with the expectation that the sacrifice will not ultimately have to be carried out. Instead of physical death, therefore, we're allowed to read this story as witnessing to something else. We're watching a man who has finally seen a promise fulfilled. We are watching Abraham, who takes pride in this son of laughter that he waited for so long, being asked to relinquish control over the life of that son and the worth that that son brings to Abraham. The question here before the man is, will he give up control over the life of his son and the value that that son gives to him, Abraham? Can he see Isaac not as the fulfillment of the promise, but as the initiator of a promise that will extend far past the value that he brings to Abraham himself? And in that interpretation of the story, in that series of questions, we come to approach something in this tortured journey that touches us. Some of you went on that journey this week. It wasn't to climb Mount Moriah. It was to send a kid off on the first day of kindergarten. Take your daughter, the one you love, Sarah, Lucy, Jane. Take your son, your older son, the one you love, John Luke, Jack, and put them on a bus with kids they don't know, to go into a classroom with a teacher you don't know, and all the questions that come. Will the other kids be kind? Will he be able to make friends? What if he can't get his milk open at lunch? And you realize in those moments that all you have are those words of Abraham: the Lord will provide. Jehovah Jireh. We cannot do it. And when we cannot do it, that's all there is. Even newer parents who haven't sent a kid to kindergarten, they understand this loss of control entering that journey. Even that first night, the child sleeps for 6 consecutive hours, but you wake up with a start and rush into their room to make sure they're still breathing. You're up and down again and again. You're so exhausted, you don't know what to do. You can't solve all the problems. Why won't he stop crying? I remember when Rebecca and I were new in this journey of parenthood, I was talking to an older, more experienced parent about how difficult and tiring and exhausting and out of control it often felt, and she listened attentively, and she said, yes, you're absolutely right, but just wait until they get a driver's license, then you'll never sleep again. Take your son, the one you love, put him behind a wheel of a car that can fly up to 100 miles an hour with other screaming death machines on the road driven by irresponsible drivers. Wear your seatbelt. Don't speed. Do not look at your phone while you're driving. But you can't control it. Jehovah Jireh. Or take your child, the one you love, and climb the mountain to Target to buy the supplies for the college dorm room, and take them to Charlottesville or Blacksburg or Richmond, up the road to Lexington or on a mountaintop in Tennessee, and leave them there. You know what could happen? Don't drink and drive. Get to that 8 o'clock class on time. Know when it's time to study and when it's time to party. Be safe. But you can't control it. Jehovah Jireh. See, it's one thing to say we trust the promises of God. It's another to relinquish control and actually live by faith in the promise when it looks like we're marching on an unknown path that is fraught and perilous. To walk in trust, the Lord will provide. The prophet Micah knows about such a perilous journey of trust with God, not involving parenthood, but relatedly, he cries out, "Shall I give up my firstborn for my transgressions, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul?" He's asking, should I sacrifice my child? But the response from God, of course, is no. He has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? Not child sacrifice, but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God. You see, the test that comes from God is always a choice. It is not a suffering that is thrust upon us without an opportunity for us to respond. God tests our faith in those moments when we have to decide, will we pursue justice if it costs us something in our reputation or our material comforts? Will we practice the way of kindness when all around us is vicious speech and vitriol? Will we walk with humility in a culture obsessed with shameless self-promotion and self-creation? To give up control and walk in faith. That our life is not our own, but is a gift from God that is to be lived as a sacrifice back to God. Jehovah Jireh. But lest this seem overwhelming and impossible, an unreachable goal, we are also shown in this story a gracious God who provides. There is never expectation without provision. Here it is the ram on the mountain just before the moment of death. Note that the provision of the ram does not eliminate the suffering, the tragedy, and the struggles of life. Abraham and Isaac must still ascend the mountain. They carry the wood, the fire, the knife. Abraham builds the altar. He binds his son. But then, somehow, in the turmoil and the struggle and the pain and the agony, God provides some way for them to see it through. In the Jewish faith, every time the shofar, the ram's horn, is sounded, it is to remind the people of God's trustworthiness and God's promises. This ram in the thicket, a path of dry ground through the Red Sea, manna in the wilderness, water from the rock, instructions to guide them together in community, a land flowing with milk and honey, a return home from exile. Keep journeying along the path. Test your faith and look for the provision where it may come. And thus the enigma of this story. A comfortable faith that is never tested is complacency. That's the place of triumphal religiosity, where because I know God and I trust in God, everything in my life will always go well. That is not the faith of Abraham. That is not the faith of this story. Faith is tested and tried, and it must be chosen amidst the easier and more tangible alternatives. A tepid Jehovah Jireh, claimed with no expectation of struggle, is not a lasting faith. On the other side, though, is struggle without any provision. Some prefer to live here, where there is something challenging that we're called to live out. It's a test, so I better fulfill it so that I know that I've earned or deserved or value my reward. Here you have a God of great sovereignty, but a God of no unexpected grace. No ram in the thicket. No Jehovah Jireh. But Abraham won't let us veer to the place of complacent faith without testing. Nor must we live in the desperation that we have to climb this mountain and carry out the terrible command to completion. Lived faith tests our mettle, but the gracious God provides what we cannot summon within ourselves. Several thousand years after Abraham, one of his descendants would put this life of faith this way: if any wishes to become my disciple, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For anyone who wishes to save their life will lose it, but anyone who loses their life for my sake will find it. And ever since that call went out, men and women have stepped out on the journey not knowing where it will end. They've stepped out of their own importance, their own namesake, their own family, not knowing where the journey will end. And up until this day, they and maybe even we have climbed the mountain and discovered that what was asked of us was not actually the sacrifice of our loves and ourselves. But instead, on the journey, we found a new provision, a gift from God. The God whose call to faith is always accompanied by the provision we need to sustain it. So as we journey, as we walk that pilgrim way, filled with unknowing, filled with uncertainty, unsure if we can hold to the faith of God in the time of testing, may Abraham's words burrow deep within us. Jehovah Jireh.